Koda had pressed both hands flat against the lower viewing glass and gone completely still, his broad shoulders blocking the corner he normally ignored. At first, Daniel Brooks thought the silverback had spotted a reflection. Then Koda lowered his face until his eyes were only inches above the concrete ledge and made a low, breathy sound Daniel had never heard him direct at that part of the habitat. Families kept moving behind the glass at the crowded wildlife park outside Columbus, Ohio, pushing strollers and balancing paper cups while children pointed toward the gorillas. Koda ignored every one of them. His attention stayed fixed on something below the visitor's line of sight. Daniel stepped closer to the keeper gate. Koda immediately shifted sideways with him. Daniel stopped. Koda stopped. That was the first thing that felt wrong. The second was the food. A chunk of apple lay untouched behind Koda's heel. Daniel had worked around him long enough to know that abandoning a favorite treat usually meant something else had taken priority. He raised his radio but didn't call anyone yet. On the public side, 7-year-old Noah Parker was weaving through the visitors with his mother, Rachel, who was trying to read a habitat sign while keeping track of him. Nothing about the afternoon looked unusual. Then a faint metallic knock came from somewhere beneath the walkway. Koda's head snapped toward it. Daniel heard it too. He glanced toward a service corridor behind the habitat, expecting a maintenance worker. The corridor door was closed. Koda moved away from the glass, crossed several feet of ground, then returned to exactly the same spot. This time he didn't touch the window. He crouched, tilted his head, and listened. A teenager near the railing laughed nervously and lifted his phone. Someone farther back said the gorilla looked angry. Daniel didn't agree, but he couldn't name what he was seeing either. Koda wasn't displaying toward the crowd. He wasn't challenging another gorilla. He seemed to be tracking something he couldn't quite locate. Then came another sound, softer than the first. 3 quick taps. Koda rose at once. His movement was fast enough that several visitors backed away from the glass. Daniel lifted one hand and asked everyone nearest the window to give the animal space. Koda paced several yards along the barrier, stopped, and looked down again. Rachel barely noticed. Noah had been beside her seconds earlier, asking whether gorillas could recognize faces. Now she was answering a question from another parent whose stroller had bumped her shoe. Daniel keyed his radio. "Marcus, can you check the lower service access for me?" Security Officer Marcus Reed answered through a wash of static. "What's going on?" Daniel watched Koda turn toward the same hidden corner for the 4th time. "I'm not sure yet." Before Marcus could respond, a plastic bottle rolled across the viewing floor and struck the base of the railing. Koda didn't even glance at it. That changed Daniel's thinking. If the crowd noise wasn't driving the behavior, something else was. He moved toward the side gate for a better angle. Koda followed him again, but instead of watching Daniel's face, the gorilla kept looking past him toward the floor beyond the glass. Daniel felt the first real edge of urgency. A keeper beside him reached for the shift door controls, ready to guide Koda into the indoor holding area if necessary. Daniel told her to wait. Then Koda struck the ground once with the heel of his hand and hurried back to the corner. The crowd recoiled. Rachel turned at the commotion and instinctively reached beside her. Her hand closed on empty air. She looked down. Noah's red baseball cap was lying near a bench, but Noah wasn't there. "Noah," she called, still calm enough to expect an answer. Daniel heard the name just as another faint metallic sound rose from beneath the walkway. This time it was followed by something quieter, almost swallowed by the voices around them. Koda heard it. He dropped to the glass, stared downward, then looked directly at Daniel. Rachel called Noah again, louder. Daniel stepped to the edge of the restricted service entrance and finally saw what Koda had been watching. Noah's small sneaker, wedged beneath the bottom of a maintenance gate where no child was supposed to be. Daniel stopped before touching the maintenance gate. The sneaker was small, gray with a white sole, and only the toe was visible beneath the metal frame. Behind him, Rachel called Noah's name again, but Coda reacted before anyone else did. The silverback lowered himself beside the glass and rested his knuckles on the concrete, no longer moving from side to side. The change was so complete that Daniel noticed it immediately. A minute earlier, Coda had been impossible to ignore. Now he was quiet, listening toward the hidden space beneath the walkway. Daniel had seen that kind of patience in him before, usually over ordinary things visitors never noticed. Coda could spend 10 minutes turning a cardboard tube between his fingers after the food inside was gone, or sit beside a shallow puddle watching drops fall from an overhead branch. He rarely wasted movement. That was why Daniel could not dismiss what he was doing now. Marcus arrived and began clearing visitors away from the service entrance while another staff member stayed with Rachel. Daniel remained where Coda could see him. When he moved 2 steps to the left, Coda's eyes followed, then returned to the lower corner. It felt less like agitation now and more like waiting. Yet something still did not fit. The maintenance gate was outside the gorilla habitat. Coda could not see through the solid lower wall from where he sat. Daniel crouched and examined the narrow opening beneath it. There was no movement from the sneaker. He called Noah's name once, gently. No answer came. Behind the glass, Coda picked up a thin piece of straw, rolled it between his fingertips, then let it fall. It was a tiny habit Daniel recognized from quiet afternoons, something Coda often did when concentrating on a sound beyond his view. That familiar gesture made the moment strangely harder to watch. Coda did not look frightened. He looked attentive. Daniel remembered seeing him behave that way when a sparrow once became trapped near a drainage grate. He had sat several feet away, head tilted, following every flutter until the bird found its way out. Daniel had never thought much about it afterward. Now Coda tilted his head in exactly the same way. A soft scraping noise came from beyond the gate. Rachel heard it and stepped forward, but Marcus gently asked her to stay back while staff checked the restricted area. Coda rose halfway, then settled again. His eyes remained fixed downward. Daniel noticed something else. The gorilla had brought nothing with him from the feeding area except a short willow twig still caught loosely between 2 fingers. Normally he stripped the bark carefully, leaving pale curls scattered around his feet. This one was untouched. Coda simply held it. For Daniel, that abandoned little routine carried more weight than any dramatic display could have. Whatever had captured Coda's attention had held it completely. Then the sneaker shifted less than an inch. Rachel covered her mouth. Daniel immediately spoke toward the gap, keeping his voice steady. "Noah, this is Daniel. You do not need to move. We are right here." There was still no spoken reply. Instead, a faint rubbing sound traveled through the service passage. Coda leaned closer to the glass. His fingers opened, and a willow twig dropped unnoticed onto the concrete. Daniel glanced toward Marcus. They both understood that the situation required care, but neither yet understood how Noah had reached a secured area that should have been inaccessible from the public walkway. Marcus checked the latch. It was closed. The indicator above it showed green. Daniel looked back at Coda. The silverback was no longer watching the gate. His gaze had shifted several feet farther along the wall, toward a narrow drainage channel disappearing beneath the viewing platform. Then, from somewhere inside that channel, came 3 soft taps in the same rhythm Daniel had heard earlier. Coda immediately moved to follow the sound, and Daniel realized the sneaker beneath the gate might not mark where Noah was at all. Coda moved along the inside wall without rushing, stopping where the drainage channel passed beneath a steel service grate near the far end of the viewing platform. Daniel followed from the staff side while Marcus kept the public walkway clear. The 3 taps did not come again. Instead, Coda placed one knuckle against the concrete beside the grate, lifted it, and shifted several feet farther down. He repeated the motion twice, almost as if different points along the wall were giving him different information. Daniel had never seen him investigate the enclosure that way. When Daniel approached the matching section outside, Coda immediately left it. He crossed toward a raised wooden platform, climbed halfway up, and turned one ear toward the drainage line below. That changed Daniel's first assumption. Coda was not simply following a sound from one fixed location. He seemed to be adjusting his position whenever Daniel moved. Daniel asked Marcus to check whether the service plans showed where the channel ran beneath the public area. Marcus pulled up the facility map on his phone while another keeper, Allison Grant, prepared the indoor shift area as a precaution. Rachel stood with a staff member about 20 feet away, answering questions about the last place she had seen Noah. Then Coda did something quieter and stranger. He picked up an empty plastic enrichment barrel, rolled it toward the wall, and left it there. The hollow container amplified a faint vibration from the concrete with a dull little rattle. Coda touched the barrel, withdrew his hand, and moved again. Daniel felt the explanation shifting beneath him. Perhaps Coda was not tracking a voice at all. Marcus found the drainage route on the map. It curved beneath the platform before connecting to a maintenance collection box roughly 30 feet from the gate. Daniel headed toward that location. Coda moved in the opposite direction. For several seconds, Daniel wondered whether the animal's behavior had been meaningless after all. Then Coda stopped beside a vertical support post and tapped the concrete once with his fingertips. A second later, a muffled sound answered from somewhere below. Not 3 taps this time. 1. Daniel froze. Marcus heard it too. They exchanged a quick look and changed direction. Coda had already moved on. The silverback crossed the habitat toward a pile of wood wool used for enrichment, gathered a loose handful, and carried it to a narrow seam near the base of the wall. Instead of playing with it, he released the fibers directly over the seam. Several strands trembled although the air inside the enclosure was still. Daniel crouched on the other side. A weak draft brushed his fingers from a vent opening near the floor. That introduced a new possibility. The drainage channel might connect with a larger service cavity beneath the platform, and sound could be traveling through it in ways that made Noah seem closer than he was. Allison quietly told Daniel that Coda was becoming harder to read. He agreed. The gorilla was not displaying in the usual sense, but his movements were growing more deliberate. Daniel asked her to keep the shift door available without calling Coda inside yet. Then Coda abandoned the wall entirely. He climbed onto a low artificial rock ledge, reached toward a hanging fire hose used for enrichment, and pulled it sideways until the rubber line became taut. He released it. The hose swung back and lightly struck the structure. A muted thump traveled through the platform. From below came another sound, too faint to identify. Rachel called Noah's name. Nothing answered her. Coda pulled the hose a second time, but Daniel raised his hand instinctively, watching. The gorilla released it again. Another thump. This time 2 weak knocks came back from beneath the floor. Marcus immediately radioed maintenance and requested access to the lower utility corridor. Daniel thought Coda would remain near the hose. Instead, the silverback descended, crossed directly past the enrichment barrel, and stopped at the oldest section of concrete. Wall. He ran his fingers along a narrow metal inspection plate Daniel had barely noticed in years of working there. Then Coda hooked the edge with his fingertips, gave it a brief testing pull, and stepped away. The plate did not open, but something behind it made a soft hollow sound. Daniel approached from the service side and saw a matching panel partly hidden behind a storage cabinet. Before he could reach it, Coda returned carrying the untouched willow twig. He pushed the thin end carefully into the seam beside his plate, withdrew it, smelled the tip, and instantly moved backward. Then, for the first time, he struck the metal plate with both open palms and released a deep call that brought every conversation on the walkway to a stop. The deep call had barely faded when Allison made the choice Daniel knew she had to make. She reached for the shift controls and opened the route to Coda's indoor holding area. With maintenance workers preparing to enter the utility corridor below, the habitat needed to be secured, and no one could safely work around hidden access points while a 400-pound silverback remained beside them. Daniel understood every part of the decision. Still, when the familiar chime sounded from the holding room, Coda did not turn toward it. He stayed beside the inspection plate, one hand resting on the concrete as if the wall itself still held his attention. Allison offered the usual verbal cue. Coda glanced toward her, then back at the plate. Daniel felt a knot form in his stomach. Coda knew that cue. He normally responded without hesitation because moving between spaces was part of his daily care. Today he took 2 steps toward the indoor doorway, paused, and looked over his shoulder. A faint knock came through the wall. Coda immediately returned. Allison lowered her voice. "We cannot open that corridor with him here." She was right. Marcus had already reported that maintenance was waiting behind the locked lower access door, and every extra minute mattered for Noah. Daniel picked up Coda's reward bucket and shook it once. The familiar sound usually brought him over quickly. Coda looked at the bucket but made no move toward it. Instead, he placed the willow twig beside the metal plate and pushed it flat against the floor with one finger. The gesture was small enough that most visitors would have missed it. Daniel did not. He had the uncomfortable feeling that Coda was marking the place he did not want to leave. Rachel stood farther back with both hands wrapped around Noah's red cap. She was trying to remain composed while staff explained that the lower corridor might give them another route beneath the platform. No one was wasting time, and no one was treating Coda unfairly. That somehow made the moment harder. The safest plan for Noah required removing the one animal that seemed unwilling to abandon that section of wall. Daniel tried another familiar cue, stepping toward the holding doorway and waiting. Coda followed 3 paces. For a second, Daniel thought it might work. Then a dull scrape traveled through the concrete. Coda stopped so abruptly that Daniel stopped too. The silverback turned, crossed back to the inspection plate, and sat beside it with his back partly toward the open holding door. He was not displaying. He was not resisting in any dramatic way. He simply refused to put distance between himself and that sound. Allison checked the time and called Dr. Lauren Mitchell over the radio. Lauren had been monitoring the situation from the veterinary building and agreed that they could not allow uncertainty around the habitat to delay the search below. Her recommendation was calm and practical: use the established shifting routine, close Coda indoors, then let maintenance inspect every connected space. Daniel knew she was correct. Yet Coda touched the metal plate again, and 2 soft knocks answered from somewhere beyond it. Daniel looked toward Marcus. "Did you hear that?" Marcus nodded, but his radio immediately crackled with another update. The lower utility team had found the drainage junction shown on the map. It was empty. That should have narrowed the search. Instead, it made Coda's fixation on the wall feel even more important. Daniel asked for 30 more seconds. Allison gave him 20. He approached the glass and crouched near Coda's position. "Come on, buddy," he said quietly, using the same steady tone he used during ordinary shifts. Coda looked at him for a long moment. Then he picked up the willow twig, carried it halfway toward the holding doorway, and stopped. Daniel's hope rose. Coda placed the twig on the floor, turned around, and went back to the wall. Allison exhaled softly. There was no anger in her face, only concern. The search team could not remain waiting. She contacted Lauren again, confirmed the procedure, and then looked at Daniel. "We have to finish the shift." Daniel stepped away from the glass. A second keeper positioned herself at the indoor station with Koda's preferred treats while Allison prepared to close each access point behind him as he moved. Koda finally stood and began walking toward the holding area, but every few feet he turned his head toward the inspection plate. When he crossed the threshold, Daniel heard another faint sound inside the wall. Koda heard it too. He spun toward the habitat, but the secured shift door was already descending between him and the place he had refused to leave. The shift door settled into place, leaving Koda inside while Daniel and Marcus moved the storage cabinet away from the matching inspection panel. Two maintenance workers joined them with flashlights and a facility tablet showing utility lines beneath the habitat. The panel opened onto a narrow service cavity filled with conduit, drain piping, and several inches of empty space before the passage turned out of sight. There was no child visible inside. Marcus called Noah's name into the opening. Silence answered him. For a moment, Daniel wondered whether the sounds had traveled from somewhere entirely different. Then his flashlight caught a pale streak across the dust on the bottom of the cavity. It looked fresh, but it was too narrow to identify as a footprint. One maintenance worker suggested it might have been left by a cable dragged through during repairs. That explanation made sense until they found a second mark 6 feet farther in, where no recent work had been logged. Marcus checked the maintenance tablet. The cavity connected to 3 separate spaces beneath the viewing platform, which meant the sounds could have traveled from almost anywhere along the structure. Daniel asked him to tap gently on the metal frame. Marcus did. The noise echoed in 2 directions, making its source almost impossible to judge. That weakened Daniel's growing belief that Koda had somehow pinpointed Noah's location. Perhaps the gorilla had simply been reacting to vibrations. Then Allison called from the indoor station. Koda was doing something different. Daniel returned to the observation window and found him seated near the holding room wall, not beside the door back to the habitat. He had positioned himself near a ventilation register close to the floor. Every few seconds, he leaned toward it, then shifted his weight toward the left. Daniel checked the building plan. The vent did not connect to the drainage channel. It ran beside it for several yards before turning toward another service chamber. That opened an entirely new possibility. Marcus and one maintenance worker followed the vent route while Daniel stayed near Koda. Rachel had given staff a description of Noah's clothes: blue shirt, khaki shorts, gray sneakers. His red cap was still in her hands. A radio message came from below. They had found something near the second chamber. Daniel hurried over. On the concrete floor beneath a narrow access opening lay a small blue plastic piece, no larger than a quarter. Rachel identified it immediately as the broken end of the zipper pull from Noah's backpack. It proved he had been near that area, but not when, or where he had gone afterward. The backpack itself was missing. Marcus called into the chamber. This time a faint sound followed, but it resembled air moving through a loose metal cover more than a voice. They checked the space and found it empty. Daniel's certainty slipped again. If Noah had passed through there, he might now be somewhere beyond the mapped utility route. Back inside, Koda had left the vent. He was sitting near the center of the holding room with his head slightly raised. When Daniel entered the staff corridor, Koda moved to the far wall. Daniel stopped. Koda moved back toward the vent. Daniel stepped away, and Koda shifted again. It took Daniel several repetitions to notice the pattern. Koda was not following him. He was changing position whenever footsteps sounded in the corridor, as though comparing those vibrations with something else. Daniel asked everyone nearby to stand still. The building became unusually quiet. Air moved through the ventilation system. A cart squeaked somewhere beyond the veterinary hallway. For nearly 15 seconds, nothing happened. Then Coda turned toward the floor. His fingers curled lightly against the rubber mat. Daniel felt nothing beneath his shoes. Coda moved 3 feet to the right and waited. Marcus came over the radio to report that the third service chamber was also empty. Rachel's breathing caught behind Daniel, but Lauren quietly reassured her that the search was expanding. Not stopping. Daniel was about to answer Marcus when Coda touched the floor twice with the tips of his fingers. A moment later, a barely audible vibration passed through the wall. Daniel crouched beside the baseboard and noticed a narrow seam where the holding room foundation met the older viewing structure. The original construction plans showed no passage there. Maintenance pulled archived renovation drawings from the facility server. A section added 12 years earlier appeared on the older plan but had disappeared from the current map, apparently sealed during a remodel. Marcus stared at the screen. The forgotten space ran directly beneath the public benches. They moved toward its former access point and found it covered by a removable utility panel. Daniel swept his flashlight across the floor before anyone opened it. At the bottom edge, caught in the dust, was a single bright red thread. Rachel looked down at the cap clenched in her hands and slowly turned it over. A fresh section of stitching along the back had been torn loose. Marcus removed the utility panel while Daniel held the flashlight low. Behind it was not another narrow pipe chase but a shallow service void extending beneath the benches, an older section left between the original foundation and the newer viewing platform. Dust covered most of the floor, except for one uneven trail leading toward a support column nearly 20 feet inside. Marcus called Noah's name. For 2 seconds there was nothing. Then a small voice answered, weak but unmistakable. Mom. Rachel closed her eyes and pressed the red cap against her chest. Daniel felt the tension in his shoulders release, but the question that had followed them for the past half-hour remained. How had Coda known? Maintenance opened a safer access point farther along the void while Marcus kept speaking to Noah, asking him to stay where he was. The boy explained in short sentences that his cap had blown beneath a bench near a loose service cover. He had reached after it, slipped into the low space, then moved deeper when he thought he saw another way out. The backpack zipper had caught on an edge. Somewhere along the way, the cap had snagged too. Every clue now had a place, but Daniel was still thinking about Coda. He returned to the habitat plans and laid the old renovation drawing beside the current map. The forgotten void ran beneath the public benches, past the inspection plate beside Coda's enclosure, continued alongside the drainage channel, and finally crossed beneath the foundation of the indoor holding room. It was not one mysterious location. It was one connected structure. The metallic knocks, the vibrations, the moving sounds, even the weak draft through the seam had all traveled through it. Daniel looked through the glass at Coda and understood why the gorilla had kept changing positions. Coda had not been confused. Noah had been moving. Each time the boy crawled, tapped, or shifted against the structure, the sound reached a different surface. Coda had followed those changes from the only places available to him. The concrete wall. The drainage grate. The support post. The inspection plate. Even the hollow enrichment barrel had carried vibration differently when it touched the floor. Daniel remembered Coda placing his knuckles against the concrete, dropping wood wool over the seam, pulling the hanging hose, and pushing the willow twig into the plate. At the time, each action had seemed unrelated. Now they formed a sequence. Coda had been testing the environment with touch, sound, and movement, repeatedly returning to whichever point gave him the strongest response. He had never been trying to get closer to the crowd. He had been trying to locate something underneath it. The most painful realization came next. When staff shifted Coda indoors for safety, they thought they were removing a complication from the search. Instead, they had moved him onto another section of the same connected foundation. That was why he had gone straight to the floor vent. That was why he kept repositioning when footsteps passed through the corridor. He was still tracking the disturbance, only from a different room. Nothing about his behavior had changed. Only the human's interpretation of it had. Marcus finally reached Noah through the maintenance opening and guided him carefully toward the access point. When the boy emerged, dusty and frightened but able to walk, Rachel dropped to her knees and wrapped both arms around him. Daniel stepped back to give them space. Around him, radios quieted one by one. Allison lowered her hand from the shift controls. Lauren stood beside the corridor entrance, watching mother and son without speaking. Then Daniel glanced through the indoor window. Coda had moved away from the vent. For the first time since the trouble began, he was no longer testing the floor or listening at the wall. He simply sat with his hands resting loosely in front of him. Noah looked past his mother's shoulder and saw the gorilla through the distant glass. "Was he making all that noise because of me?" he asked. Daniel did not answer. Immediately, he looked at the forgotten plans, the willow twig still lying near the wall, and the silverback who had finally become quiet. Rachel followed his gaze. Her face changed as she understood what Daniel had only just understood himself. While an entire walkway full of people had been searching where their eyes told them to search, Coda had been listening to the child beneath their feet. Rachel kept one arm around Noah while a staff member checked the boy over, but her attention kept drifting toward the indoor window. Coda had turned slightly away from the glass. The enormous animal who had occupied every person's attention minutes earlier now seemed interested only in rubbing a piece of straw between his fingers. Rachel looked down at the red cap in her hand. A few loose threads hung from the torn seam. She brushed the dust from the brim with her thumb, stopped, and held it against Noah's shoulder. "I thought I was watching you," she said quietly. Noah leaned closer without answering. Across the corridor, Daniel picked up Coda's reward bucket. He had carried it through the entire search, and only now noticed how tightly he had been gripping the handle. He set it down without offering anything. Rewarding Coda for behavior the staff did not fully understand felt strangely inadequate. Instead, Daniel walked to the observation window and waited. Coda glanced at him once, then returned to the straw. On the habitat side, the untouched willow twig still rested near the inspection plate. Daniel could see it from where he stood. Hours earlier it would have meant nothing. Now it felt like a marker left beside the one place Coda had refused to abandon. Allison came to stand beside Daniel. Neither spoke for several seconds. Finally she said, "He kept going back." Daniel nodded. Every time. There was no accusation in her voice. She had followed the safest procedure available, and Daniel knew he would make the same decision again with the information they had possessed then. Still, Allison looked toward the closed shift door and rubbed her thumb over the edge of the control panel. "We were trying to move him away from the problem," she said. Daniel watched Coda lift his head toward a distant sound. "We did not know he had already found it." Nearby, Marcus crouched beside Noah and returned the small blue zipper piece recovered from the service chamber. Noah turned it over in his palm, then asked if they could fix it back onto his backpack. Marcus smiled and said they probably could. Noah slipped the piece into his pocket instead. Then he looked through the glass again. "Is he mad at me?" The question made Daniel turn. Coda was sitting calmly now, shoulders loose, attention moving between the room and the familiar sounds around him. Daniel shook his head. "I do not think this was ever about being mad." Noah considered that for a moment, then pulled away from his mother's side just enough to stand on his own. He did not approach the glass. He simply raised the red cap chest high where Koda could see it. Koda's eyes moved toward the color. He paused with the straw between his fingers. Rachel's hand found Noah's shoulder again. For 2 or 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then Koda lowered the straw and shifted closer to the front of the holding room. Not quickly. Not dramatically. He stopped several feet from the window and sat. Noah lowered the cap. Daniel could hear the ventilation fan humming overhead and a maintenance cart rolling somewhere down the corridor. After everything that had happened, the ordinary sounds felt almost too loud. Rachel looked at Daniel. Did he know it was Noah? Daniel chose his words carefully. I cannot tell you what Koda understood. I can tell you he detected something we did not, and he kept responding to it until Noah was found. Rachel nodded slowly. That answer seemed to matter more because Daniel had not tried to turn Koda into something he was not. She crouched beside Noah and straightened the collar of his blue shirt. Then she looked back through the glass. Thank you, she whispered, though there was no reason to believe Koda understood the words. Koda remained where he was. His fingers rested against the floor, completely still. Noah put the cap back on his head, crooked because of the torn stitching. Before staff led them toward the medical room for a final check, he turned once more. Koda had already picked up the straw again. Noah smiled at that small return to normal and reached into his pocket, closing his fingers around the broken blue zipper piece. Daniel watched mother and son disappear down the corridor, then looked at Koda. The silverback touched the straw to the floor, listened for a moment, heard nothing unusual beneath it, and quietly began pulling it apart. By the time Noah finished his medical check, the public walkway had grown quiet again. The loose service cover had been secured, maintenance tape marked the section beneath the benches, and 2 workers were measuring the old access space that had disappeared from the newer facility plans. Inside the habitat, Koda had returned to his afternoon routine. Daniel watched him peel bark from the willow twig he had ignored earlier, turning it carefully between his fingers before setting the clean stem beside his foot. That simple return to habit brought Daniel more relief than he expected. Then Koda paused and touched 2 fingertips to the concrete. Daniel waited. No answering vibration came. Koda continued peeling the twig. Over the next several days, the staff reviewed what had happened without trying to make Koda's behavior into something it was not. Lauren compared keeper notes with security footage while Daniel marked each place Koda had stopped. The pattern matched the old service void almost perfectly. A maintenance engineer demonstrated how tapping one section of the structure could carry through the concrete and metal farther than anyone standing above would expect. Daniel listened, then noticed something on the footage they had missed. Koda had reacted to the first faint disturbance nearly 40 seconds before Daniel had heard anything. The discovery changed a small part of the staff routine. No new tricks were taught, and no special performance was expected from Koda. Instead, Daniel began writing down unusual changes in attention with more detail, location, duration, nearby sounds, even whether Koda touched a particular surface. Allison added a copy of the old renovation plan to the current emergency binder. Marcus walked the entire public area with maintenance and checked every low panel, latch, and gap. Near the bench where Noah had disappeared, one addition appeared the following week. A simple secured barrier that looked so ordinary most visitors never noticed it. Koda noticed the workers installing it. He sat nearby for 11 minutes, watching the drill vibrate against the structure. When they finished, he walked away. Rachel and Noah returned on a quiet weekday afternoon 2 weeks later. Noah carried the same backpack, now repaired, but the blue zipper piece Marcus had found was not attached to it. He had threaded it onto a small cord around one of the shoulder straps instead. His red cap had been restitched too, with a darker red thread that made the repaired section easy to see if someone looked closely. Rachel did not hurry him toward the viewing glass. They stood several feet back while Daniel explained where Coda was resting. Noah found him first. The silverback was sitting in a patch of afternoon light, sorting lettuce leaves from a scatter of enrichment material. Noah gave a small wave, then seemed embarrassed by it and put his hand in his pocket. Coda continued sorting. For a moment, Rachel smiled as if that ordinary indifference was exactly what she had hoped to see. Then Coda picked up a cardboard tube and carried it toward the lower section of glass. He sat there without looking directly at Noah and began working a piece of lettuce from inside the tube. Noah lowered himself onto the bench. The distance between them remained exactly what it was supposed to be: glass, concrete, and several feet of protected space. Still, Noah stayed longer than Rachel expected. He watched Coda rotate the tube, shake it once, and inspect the other end. "He likes figuring things out," Noah said. Daniel smiled. "He does." That was all. Before leaving, Rachel handed Daniel a folded card. She asked him not to put it on display. Later, in the keeper office, Daniel opened it. Noah had drawn Coda beside a gray wall with a red cap on the other side. There were no superhero symbols, no dramatic words, only two small blue marks beneath the floor. Daniel placed the drawing beside Coda's daily care log. The next afternoon, while entering his notes, he glanced through the office window and saw Coda settle near the habitat wall. A maintenance cart rolled beneath the platform. Coda listened briefly, recognized the familiar vibration, and went back to his food. Daniel looked at Noah's drawing once more, then wrote a single ordinary sentence in the log. Coda remained calm and attentive throughout the afternoon. The weeks that followed were quieter than anyone involved would have predicted. Visitors still gathered at the glass, children still pressed close enough for parents to remind them to step back, and Coda still moved through his days according to rhythms that belonged entirely to him. Some afternoons he carried cardboard tubes beneath one arm. On others, he sat near the shaded wall and carefully separated pieces of bark until a small pile collected beside his feet. Daniel stopped expecting the place to feel different. Most days, it did not. Then he would pass the keeper office, notice Noah's drawing beside the care log, and remember how easily something important could exist just beyond where people happened to be looking. Rachel and Noah began returning every few weeks, never on a fixed schedule. Noah no longer rushed toward the habitat. He usually stopped first at the repaired bench, checked the secured panel beneath it, and then continued toward the viewing area. The blue zipper piece remained tied to his backpack. Daniel once asked why he had not replaced it with a new one. Noah shrugged and said, "This one still works for remembering." Daniel did not ask him to explain. One cool afternoon in early fall, Noah arrived wearing the red cap again. The darker stitching along the back had faded slightly from use. Coda was near the far side of the habitat, sitting beneath a tree with his back partly toward the visitors. Noah found an empty place along the glass but chose the bench instead. Rachel sat beside him. Neither tried to get Coda's attention. For several minutes they simply watched him gather fallen leaves, inspect them, and let most of them slip through his fingers. A little girl nearby asked her father why the gorilla was not doing anything. Her father smiled and told her that maybe he simply did not feel like doing anything today. Noah heard that and quietly smiled. After a while, Coda rose and crossed the habitat. He stopped near the section of wall where the inspection plate had once become the center of everything. The plate had since been secured and documented, but from the public side it looked no different from any other piece of the enclosure. Coda touched the concrete briefly, listened, and continued walking. Noah followed the movement with his eyes. Rachel reached over and straightened the crooked brim of his cap. This time he let her. Daniel was completing his afternoon rounds when Noah called his name. The boy reached into his backpack and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was another drawing, but simpler than the first. There was Coda on one side of the glass and Noah on the other. Between them, Noah had drawn a thin gray line across the bottom of the page. Daniel turned the picture over, expecting a message. The back was blank. "What is the line?" he asked. Noah looked toward the habitat. "The floor," he said. Daniel nodded and handed the drawing back. Noah folded it carefully and returned it to his bag. The sun had dropped low enough to throw long shadows across the walkway when Rachel said it was time to leave. Noah stood, adjusted the strap on his backpack, and looked through the glass one last time. Coda had settled near the front with a cardboard tube in his hands. He turned it slowly, listening to something loose moving inside. Noah lifted his hand but did not wave. He simply rested his palm against the strap where the little blue zipper piece hung. Coda opened the tube, found a piece of lettuce inside, and began eating. Rachel placed her hand gently between Noah's shoulders. They walked toward the exit together. Halfway down the path, Noah looked back. Coda was still there, occupied with the tube, completely unaware that the boy had stopped to watch him. Noah smiled anyway. Then he turned around, took his mother's hand, and kept walking. Thank you for watching until the end of the video.